So I mentioned in my last video that I wanted to talk a little bit about why people sometimes feel intimidated by classics. And in this video, I wanted to just go through why I think that is, why do people feel intimidated by classics, and give people advice who do feel that intimidation, ways in which they can overcome that so that they can enjoy some of the greatest books that the world has to offer. So I'll begin with my own story on this because I have also felt this intimidation, and for me it went back to school and especially Shakespeare. Now, when you're introduced to Shakespeare in school, you've probably never engaged with any sort of archaic text at all, and so suddenly you have this language being thrown at you, and yes, you can sort of understand what thee and thou mean and things like that, but the complexity of Shakespeare, it's not even, it doesn't stop there. Sometimes just the whole thing that is being said, you have no idea what is being said. You may as well be reading a different language. And so that is difficult. You then have teachers talking about symbolism and all of these intellectual things that don't seem obvious to you at all. They might if you read the text later in life and you reflect, but let's be honest, most people are so put off by Shakespeare by the end of their school experience that they never read it again, let alone will go see a play. So it's sort of off on the wrong foot together. They really do throw you into the deep end with classic texts, and I think that this is one big reason, for, at least in the UK experience, or when I was in school, which admittedly was a bit of a while ago now, but in any case, that's one reason I think why people start to feel intimidated by classics, because when they're in school, their first introduction to a classic is a text with very difficult language. And I'm not saying that I think we should not have Shakespeare in school. I think that it's worth having in school. I think one thing that my school did, which I quite liked, was that you might not necessarily read whole plays of Shakespeare. You might focus on a particular speech. It's much easier to understand what's going on then. The teacher can give a really good explanation of what's going on, and you can sort of get into the language. And I actually found that those classes that focused on famous scenes or speeches, getting us to perform them, that was quite a good way to get into Shakespeare. So I think there are some ways to integrate Shakespeare into the syllabus. But I also think that it would be better to start kids earlier. So I didn't really engage with classics until I was maybe 14, 15. So start it a bit earlier, and it's when we're starting in this earlier point that we should actually have classics that are maybe just 100 years old. So things from the 20s. You might have some Forster, you might have D.H. Lawrence, well, maybe not D.H. Lawrence, a bit racy maybe for school kids, but you get the idea. Stuff that is recognizable linguistically, but a little bit more complicated, a little bit more complex, and then you sort of work backwards from there. I think that's a much better way to deal with the classics, is to work backwards. Or maybe, some people might not like this, but maybe giving people slightly modernized translations of, say, Chaucer, because, reading Middle English, I remember an A-level class where we did some Middle English and it was horrific. I had no idea what was being said. But, a slightly modernized translation, again, you can then work back. You could even compare it with the classics so that they can sort of work back into the old language and understand it better. I think these would be little ways of making that slightly less intimidating. And then as you get to the more advanced years, then you can start going heavy on the Shakespeare or Chaucer or whatever it is in the more archaic language. So that would be one way I think we could deal with that issue, is to sort of, not go extreme right to the beginning. And I'll come on to that a little bit more later with my advice for overcoming intimidation. But yeah, I think that's one reason why people are intimidated by classics, because oftentimes the experience at school is just too much. It's throwing you in the deep end and it's just too much. A second reason why I think people are intimidated by classics is because I think that classics in general are over-intellectualized. They're seen as the province of academics who are very knowledgeable about the classics and the time periods in which these classics were written. I don't want to undermine that necessarily, but the problem with academics is they do naturally want to analyze things, and I think that is to the detriment of classics, because I think what's happened is that people feel as though those things aren't for me. That's for the elites. Shakespeare's for the elites, or Dickens is for the elites. And intellectualizing is something that I think has contributed to this issue, because it seems like in order to understand anything, you need a PhD now, and that just isn't true. I think it's true in the sciences. I think it's to some degree true of philosophy if you want to get into really understanding difficult texts. However, I think with literature, the thing to remember is these books or plays, they have always been written for public consumption. Yes, you do have postmodernists who are sort of the product of this intellectualization to a point where they can be very difficult for the ordinary person to read because they're just so complex. But when it comes to most stories throughout history, they were written with the layperson in mind. Or in some cases, not even written, right? You go far enough back and people were just telling these stories. They were just, oral tradition and all that. So most stories were always written with the public in mind. And yet maybe there were time periods when not everyone could read and stuff, but these stories would come down the pipeline in various ways. People have always been reading, or at least telling and listening to stories in some form or other. And that's the thing to remember, is that these things should not be intellectualized. They've always been for public consumption. But because they have been intellectualized, people feel as though, no, that's just too much. I can't understand this. I need to move on. A third reason, of course, is the language itself, which the further back you go, as I've said with Shakespeare, but even, say, Dickens can be quite hard to grasp if you're just not familiar with that style of writing. Jane Austen, for me, I found on my first read-through of Sense and Sensibility, especially, I had no idea what was going on half the time because the language, it wasn't that the language was overly complicated or convoluted, it was just very alien to the language, the English that I know and speak. So I found that very difficult. It took me a couple of reads of all of her novels really to appreciate them for what they were, because I just needed to get used to it. I needed time to get used to it. And so those are the three reasons why I think people are intimidated by classics. There's the school system, which I think pushes people in the deep end and focuses too much on analysis and less on enjoyment. I think that there's the language, which can also be quite daunting if you're not familiar with, older writing. And of course, I think that they've been over-intellectualized to the point where people think that the classics are just for the experts to deal with and not for them. So how do we deal with this problem? Well, I already suggested some ways in the school system that I think we can improve it. And I just want to stress that I certainly don't think that this means getting rid of Shakespeare or the classics. I think that schools are going, and even universities, are going way too far in the simplifying thing, to the point where, as I said before, you can get through courses without doing any Shakespeare or very little Shakespeare. And I think that's horrific. I think, there's something to be said for a bit of a compromise. Don't necessarily throw people in the deep end, but don't keep them in the baby pool either. Give people a nice breadth of classic. Yes, start with some more recent stuff, but start that earlier and then work back to the more difficult stuff. That's how I think it should go in terms of education. In terms of you, though, as a reader who's an adult outside of education, I would just recommend when you engage with classics, follow that trajectory, First of all, pick a genre that you like. Let's say you like fantasy, but you've not read Lord of the Rings. We'll start with Lord of the Rings then, and then maybe try something like Mervyn Peake. You might find that you really enjoy Gormenghast. And then you sort of work back. What are the influences of these writers? Well, Mervyn Peake did really admire Dickens, and actually has a Dickensian sensibility. So if you like Mervyn Peake, maybe you could then dial back to a Dickens novel. So give that a go. And that's how I would organically sort of build up my classic reading, rather than trying to, pick something really difficult and complex that's just going to annoy you because it just is so alien to what you know. So that's what I would always do. I would always start with, what do you like now, and work back from there. Everyone has seen film adaptations of Pride and Prejudice or of Dickens books. That's why I really like Dickens. My love of Dickens really is more from the films and adaptations that I saw than from him, until recently when I started reading him. But the reason why I chose Dickens is because I thought, well, if I enjoy the adaptations, it's likely that I will also enjoy the source material because it's still telling the story that I like, and actually in a lot more detail. So that's another thing that you can do as well. So don't try to tackle things that you think you should read. Try to decide, based on your preferences and the things that you like, what might be a good entry point. And don't try and read the most difficult, complex things. Always start simple, start with shorter novels, and build up to the bigger, more complex ones. And the third thing that I would say is, don't feel the need to overanalyze everything to the nth degree. As I said in my previous video on the relevance thing, I do make analysis videos and I do enjoy analyzing text. And I do believe that if you do that, you can increase your appreciation of the novels, because of course, just like with any other thing, the more you know about it, the more you can appreciate it. But don't feel the need to do that when you're reading. Reading should ultimately be about, is this an engaging story? And if you pick up symbolic things, great. If you notice themes, great. But ultimately, it should be, am I entertained by this story? And persevere with it, and I think more often than not you'll find that these stories are engaging and fun. Some you won't like, look at intellectuals who do really like classics. They all have their preferences and dislikes. Don't think that if you don't like a classic that you're a failure of a reader. I think if you just dismiss all classics, I think that is a problem, because it just seems very ridiculous, because classic isn't really a genre. It's historical tradition of novels that belong to all kinds of genres. But let's say you read Jane Austen and you just don't really like her stories. Good. I mean, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And so don't expect to like everything. Just read them like you would read an ordinary book. Yes, you'll have to put a bit more work to grasp the language and things, but outside of that, you really shouldn't feel daunted, because these are just novels like everything else, and so they should be treated in that way. And lastly, don't let people bully you into reading things in a way that works for you. I had a ridiculous comment on I can't remember what it was on. It was one of my reviews of a book where I'd listened to the audiobook, and this person said something like, your view, everything you've said about this book is invalid because you listened to the book. That's like, I don't know, I can't remember what the example they gave, but it was basically something like someone saying that, talking about a speech where they weren't there. And it's like, well, it's not quite the same, is it? Because when you listen to an audiobook, you are still listening to the story and hearing the words that were written down. So that's a ridiculous argument in my view. Yes, there might be nuanced differences in, your ability to retain information and how distracted you get when you listen versus when you read. But for some people, they can't get through a page of a book without falling asleep. I can't even sometimes do that. Sometimes I fall asleep when I read. Audiobooks, less so. So if you're like that and you find that you fall asleep all the time, pick up an audiobook. There's nothing wrong with that, and it's not a bad way to read and get the story. After all, most of these stories will have been performed in the past. A lot of people couldn't afford Dickens novels, and so what people would actually do, poorer people, is they'd band together, buy an installment of his text, and then they'd read it aloud to each other. Did they not appreciate the story that Dickens was telling? I don't think so. So that's another thing to think about. What ways do you enjoy consuming literature? And if you are open to audiobooks, I've said many times on the channel, they're a great way to consume classic texts, because it just, for some reason, it just is easier, or at least I find it easier, to understand what's going on when someone is speaking the words rather than me trying to read them. So give it a go. Try different formats. If you're reading an older text, try a modernized translation and work back. And if someone tells you, oh, you're not really reading that person's text because you read a translation, well, yes, in a sense that is true. You might not be able to appreciate the poetry of the original writer because you're not reading the language that they chose, but if it encourages you to then appreciate the story so that then you do go and read the original and actually can appreciate the poetry better because of that, then isn't that ultimately the better thing to do? So when it comes to feeling intimidated, I think the thing to do is, one, just treat the story like any other story, and two, take in the story by whatever means necessary for you to actually get the most out of it. And if that means listening to an audiobook, then do it that way. If it means reading it, do it that way. So that's everything I wanted to say on this topic. Let me know down in the comments whether you've also felt intimidated by classics, and it'd be nice to hear your stories as well as to why you think that is. And if you have any solutions yourselves, feel free to post them down in the comments as well. Otherwise, take care everyone. Ta-ra.